Okay, this is chapter 13 talking about social movements. We're going to talk a little bit about what is behind social movements and what the elements of a social movement are. So let's talk about it. Social movements typically arise from various different ground up type events, grassroots organizations, grassroots events, riots, petitions, and informal organizations, which we'll talk about in more detail here in a minute. Gandhi's civil disobedience movement inspired their independence from Britain and their single party system for decades after that. So very, very major important social movement there. Martin Luther King's boycott, the Montgomery bus system, inspired, it pretty much took the civil rights movement into the next realm. And in 1989, we had a wave of democratization in Eastern Europe against communism, and that that wave sustained itself to pretty much result in the demise of the Soviet Union, as well as the effective end of communism, you could say. Social movements often rise out of contentious politics, and they're often leaderless and emerge from civil society. However, as we saw in these previous movements, there was some sort of charismatic leader that did inspire the movement to sustain it. That might be an important point to consider. Religious organizations, hobby groups, professional organizations and associations, these are somewhat instrumental in forming social movements. Even a kind of a group that's originally intended to lobby the government may form a broader coalition and start to provide a movement that initiates change. That's kind of the whole point about it. Now, social movements are actively repressed in some states, particularly authoritarian states where they're very insecure about their power. Democracies are more conducive to social movements ruled by the people, of the people, for the people, and the leaders may actually have to find themselves in a position to pay attention to what the people are asking for. Social movements typically, or many times, rise from the, particularly in democratic societies where we can have a little bit more time to think about post-materialistic political issues like the environment, women's rights, and civil rights, ethnic relations. And they are somewhat coincided with a general decline in the centrality of political parties, and even new political parties may come up as a result of social movements. And of course, you have to have the perception that collective action can redress this grievance, and there are some sort of shared common interests that take hold in order to make it a social movement that can facilitate change in your society. So why do social movements, or what facilitates them? We do know the availability of rapid and easy communication has been a major factor, particularly when the members become more adept at using it. Interestingly enough, the French Revolution might not have occurred without the invention of print. That's something that really was able to spread information and get more people involved. And another thing that may be an important factor for social movements is the presence of potential allies in the government that are sympathetic to this opposition group or to this social movement that's trying to create some sort of change. Now, what are the core elements of a social movement? Well, first of all, there has to be sustained, organized effort making some collective demands. This is very important in order, of course, sustainability is the big question that we'll be asking ourselves here in a minute, because the Occupy Wall Street movement did not sustain itself. But organization, very important, and the demands. What are your demands? What is the point of your movement that you're trying to start? Another thing that social movements have is some form of political action. There's just lots of things that a group can do to take actions. They can form associations, coalitions. They can hold public meetings. They can organize processions, vigils, rallies, demonstrations, even strikes, petition drives. They can go to the media, make media statements, pamphleteering. This is just a form of spreading information. So there's lots of activities and physical actions that the group can do to sustain the social movement, to get out the word, to spread the word, and try to facilitate some sort of change in the society that's driving this whole movement in the first place. Now, here's a very important acronym to consider when you're reading the article on the Occupy Wall Street movement, and then when you're starting to put together your investigative report, so to speak. Does your movement represent worthiness? Is it worthy? Is there unity? Do you have the numbers? In other words, do you have the number of people that are, because again, strength in numbers type of thing. And do they have a commitment to this cause? So this is what you would call your WUNC acronym. Another basic point of the core elements of a social movement in your analysis of that article on the Occupy Wall Street movement. Now let's talk a little bit about informal organizations. Informal organizations spring up from various different reasons, as we talked about before, and they have some advantages because they can be nimble in defining and framing issues. They can shift quickly, and it can reformulate the issue as needed in order to get where it needs to go. The issue of female genital mutilation, which occurs in several underdeveloped regions, in religiously oriented regions that exert dominant male control over the young female's sexuality. And so the female circumcision is what it had generally been called. And the movement to try to weed this out, or to make this issue more aware in these regions, one of the informal processes was to redefine the term from female circumcision to female genital mutilation. Much more graphic or attention-getting to try to get to the point. That's what informal organizations can potentially do. Informal organizations aren't necessarily, the causes may not always be agreeable. Terrorist causes have roots in informal organizations. Al-Qaeda, for example, was very secretive, but they used the media quite effectively, flexible in framing their goals. And as an informal organization, where you're not quite so rule-bound yet, and you can change your tactics fairly quickly and be opportunistic in order to get your issue where it needs to be in order to start creating the social movement. Social movements typically are formed out of informal organizations, as you'll see when you start reading about the Occupy Wall Street. Informal organizations can also form networks beyond the boundaries of the state, and they can draw in similar movements in neighboring states. The Arab Spring uprising that in part inspired the Occupy Wall Street movement did have some success, but of course there are some states that are still in considerable turmoil. But the ability to cross borders is part of what made this democratization movement happen, so to speak. And this boomerang pattern that they're referring to is that other governments may turn back around and pressure your government in order to comply with this internal movement. So you may get sympathy, and this is not unusual for democratic movements in other countries. They will pretty much get the attention of countries like the United States who are willing to support and help groups that are pro democracy. Now, unfortunately, informal organizations do have some disadvantages that they have to deal with, and as part of your investigative analysis on the Occupy Wall Street, there were apparently some disadvantages that they were not able to overcome. So we have the difficulty to amass resources that the political leaders that you're trying to get their attention may not respond to. You may not have a specialized expertise or an ongoing permanent staff in order to keep it sustainable. The issue that you're dealing with might even be ephemeral, that's temporary. And if policymakers aren't too excited or interested in your demands, they could even outlast it if this issue loses steam or dies away. So that's now again, you could look at the Occupy Wall Street movement and say, what was their general concern? And I think you could certainly argue that that general concern is certainly still here. So you'd go, why did the Occupy Wall Street movement fizzle? Let's talk about just a couple of examples. The battle in Seattle was the protest in the 1999 World Trade Organization conference. There was, at the end of the 90s, the United States had experienced a very prosperous part of that decade there, part of as a result of this globalization movement that made corporations in particularly a lot more successful. But however, there was some dissatisfaction with the move towards a global economy, and that those concerns are still here. And even the Occupy Wall Street movement probably has some of its roots in this concern with the global economy, in that the United States may be not benefiting from it as much as we would like. Now, the protest in the Seattle conference there was a combination of labor union groups and anti-capitalist groups. And this is somewhat different from the Occupy Wall Street movement, although certainly there's an anti-capitalist tone to the Occupy Wall Street. That's what you'll need to read the article that I've attached and kind of get the gist of what the concerns were. But with the battle in Seattle, the local law enforcement completely unanticipated the amount of people that were going to converge on and demonstrate, and it turned out to be very chaotic, and there were some injuries and some damage. However, the battle in Seattle did highlight an anti-globalization sentiment, which still exists today, not quite as much, but certainly has the Occupy Wall Street movement does have some roots here in this anti-globalization sentiment. So you'll need to kind of weed that out a little bit in this article that I've assigned. Another interesting social movement that was somewhat temporary was the 2004 Ukraine presidential campaign. The reform opponent, Yushchenko, was poisoned, and there was a lot of speculation that the authoritarian regime was behind it. But he got, and the reason why it's called the Orange Revolution is because the poison that Yushchenko was given turned his skin orange. He survived and became very much more popular as a result, and had a lot of support. The election results were quite controversial. There was a lot of charges of tampering because of the authoritarian government that was somewhat backed by Russia, which has been turning more authoritarian over the past decade or more. So the demonstration, the Orange Revolution by the Yushchenko supporters, literally shut down the capital. It was 500,000 strong that had converged on the capital, and both Russia and EU intervened on opposite sides. So it was getting somewhat tense as far as this demonstration potentially burgeoning into an entire movement to take over the government. So the authoritarian government orders troops to attack the demonstrators. But here was an interesting twist. The Ukrainian secret police literally sympathized with the demonstrators, and they kind of turned on their own government in order to offer protection for the demonstrators. So again, this was another one of those aspects that is useful to a social movement or to any type of potential social movement. And it's if you have sympathizers in the government that are going to give you an inside track. And so the Ukrainian secret police provided that for the Orange Revolutionaries, and the authoritarian government actually relented to a new election, and Yushchenko won the election. So the Orange Revolution actually overcame the oppressiveness of the authoritarian government. However, this is one of those things that we've talked about. If you do not have a democratic political culture, which takes decades, generations to evolve into, well, you're going to have a lot of potential problems sharing power and to figuring out how you're going to operate your government and how representative it's going to be. And by 2010, Yanukovych, who was the Putin-backed authoritarian leader previously, had won back control from Yushchenko. So therefore, they had kind of reverted back to the Russian-backed authoritarian system relatively quickly. Now, of course, a lot's happened in Ukraine even since 2010. But this is just an overview of a social movement that made some progress, but did not necessarily last, so to speak. And then, of course, Ukraine, the whole problem being, of course, the fracturing along ethnic lines. So that's part of the difficulty with a democratic political culture. You haven't bought into that democratic bargain yet. Okay, here again is the core elements of a social movement. So what you want to do is refer to these basic elements here: sustained, organized effort, making collective demands, various forms of political action, and of course the very important WUNC acronym: worthiness, unity, numbers, and commitment. All right, now is read the article Preoccupied that I've attached to Moodle. This article was written just a few months after the Occupy Wall Street movement had already fizzled. The Occupy Wall Street movement occurred in the summer of 2011, and this is probably one of the best articles that literally summarized and overviewed the Occupy Wall Street movement fairly quickly after it fizzled. This article was published in late 2011. It's kind of an investigative analysis as well of the Occupy Wall Street movement. Why was the Occupy Wall Street an event rather than a movement? So what you want to do is ask yourself a few basic questions. Why was it not sustained? And going back to the previous slide, what core elements may have been weak or lacking?